A video entitled "Offshore Wind Power is Killing Whales?" A marine biologist reacts has been posted on the interwebs. And this was the unfortunate occasion for me to learn about the YouTube channel titled K-Passionate. It seems to be a channel geared towards pulling in the masses with the promise of funny animals, and then selling them this woman wearing glasses as some sort of expert as a marine biologist. Just reading through the titles of the videos, the repetition of truculent contentions that the woman in the thumbnail is in fact a marine biologist begins to give any Seinfeld fan distinct George Costanza vibes. But the K-Passionate channel is actually linked to one of the ENGOs on Save Right Whale Coalition's 2022 Offshore Wind Conflict of Interest report. And while that NGO seems to be maintaining a distinction between the K-Passionate brand and their own legacy brand, they are certainly united to do the bidding of the offshore wind developers who pay their bills. Let's watch and see if this internet marine biologist utilizes any marine biology whatsoever in her denial that the offshore wind industry is contributing to whale deaths.
A shocking amount of humpback whales have washed up along the East Coast over the last couple of months. The mystery surrounding these events has unfortunately led to people turning to pseudoscience and disinformation to use these whales' deaths for their own gain. I'm KP, a marine biologist with a decade's worth of experience working with marine mammals.
Translation: she graduated from college over 10 years ago and has been coaxing whales and otters into doing tricks for fish snacks for the water circuses we call aquariums ever since. That's one impressive resume. In this video, she thinks she's going to be debunking those rank amateurs who think offshore wind development should be evaluated for the risks of collateral damage it poses to the marine environment, not the least of which is the trail of dead whales left in its wake. Specifically, some of the key witnesses in this fight in the Mid-Atlantic region who testified under oath this past week are Cindy Ziff.
We advocate for a clean and healthy ocean with action, and for nearly 40 years, we've stood together with all of you. We've stood together with strong bipartisan support and thousands of citizens, and we've stopped ocean dumping, blocked many fossil fuel projects, and brought the ocean in this region back from the brink of collapse.
There's Megan Lapp, a fisheries liaison equipped with a master's degree in legal science who's been carefully scrutinizing the inner workings of offshore wind development for 8 of the last 11 years of KP's career of making otters do tricks for kids.
We are facing annihilation at the hands of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. Over the past 8 years, I have spent countless hours attending BOEM meetings, state meetings, workshops, webinars, stakeholder phone calls, developer meetings, writing hundreds of pages of comments, reading thousands of pages of materials, and meeting with elected and appointed officials to raise the issues I testify about today. BOEM has stonewalled and forced us into litigation as our only recourse.
And then there's Bob Stern, PhD. Long before KP was a marine biologist, Bob was in charge of the United States Department of Energy's Office of Environmental Compliance.
I previously managed the office that oversaw environmental reviews within the Department of Energy. And in that capacity, our office reviewed and recommended approval or disapproval of the environmental impact statements for that department. Along the way, we also encountered many environmental issues regarding other statutes, like the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act and the Coastal Zone Management Act. One thing I think I do know is when we're seeing good environmental reviews and when we're not.
These are just a few of the people testifying under oath about these issues, whose comments KP thinks are disinformation. Let's find out.
We're going to debunk some of this disinformation and hopefully shed some light on what is really going on behind these seemingly unusual whale strandings.
Seemingly. Yes, the mounting pile of whale corpses only seems to be unusual, but according to KP, they're actually not. This is going to be good.
One popular theory floating around is that the offshore wind farms are behind this string of whale fatalities. Several mayors and congressmen have called for a moratorium on all offshore wind activity. They're backed by an advocacy group called Clean Ocean Action, who said in a statement, This alarming number of deaths is unprecedented, and in the last half century, the only unique factor from previous years is the excessive scope, scale, and magnitude of offshore wind activity in the region. Lies. Oh.
So Cindy of Clean Ocean Action has been telling lies. I would challenge KP to elaborate on where exactly Cindy lied, because here's a clip of her sharing info to this point under oath.
In fact, since December, offshore wind surveying, which consists of the intense back and forth erratic activity of these survey boats, has increased. And I do also want to note that large commerce shipping to the port decreased by 20%. So offshore wind activity increased, large ship activity decreased.
Do you swear or affirm that this testimony you are about to give is true and correct, to the best of your knowledge, information, and beliefs, so help you God? Okay. The record will reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. You can sit down.
The thinking goes that the noise pollution created by the sonar and sounds used to map out the ocean floor permanently damages the whale's ability to navigate and communicate.
KP needs to get educated on what we're actually talking about, which is temporary deafness, not necessarily permanent deafness like she just said. We're talking about whales being temporarily deafened by low frequency noise, and then beaching themselves or surfacing and colliding with a vessel. This effect on marine mammals from low frequency noise has been termed a temporary threshold shift by scientists from NOAA.
Rising noise pollution can absolutely have a negative impact on these behaviors. However, according to the Center for Biodiversity, the top 3 loudest and most disruptive ocean noises are from military sonar, oil exploration, and commercial shipping. Notice that wind farm exploration did not make the list.
Psst, KP, that list was written in 2013. I know, it's tough. 2013, 3 of those 4 digits are the same as this year, 2023. But this year, the time we live in right now, where whales are washing up dead at an abnormal rate, this present day issue is happening a whole decade later than your source that you think you're debunking us with. A web page written in 2013 can't possibly account for events happening in 2022 and 2023, although I'm no marine biologist, okay? Sure, it would be nice if the CBD refined their campaign fundraising page, which is far from an empirical information source here, but remember, this is the same CBD that almost was able to get our lobster fishery hit with a 90% reduction within the next year over a species of whale we haven't even interacted with in going on 20 years, so they're not exactly a reputable outfit. But do go on.
Notice that wind farm exploration did not make the list. That's because the acoustic instruments used by wind projects are significantly less sound intensive than the seismic air guns used by offshore oil and gas operations that need to penetrate deeper into the seabed.
Yeah, we covered that CNN story in the past. You really would benefit from watching some of the past videos that I've done on this issue, KP. It's painfully clear you don't understand the issue we're talking about, because it doesn't take a full-sized seismic air gun to temporarily deafen a whale or cause those temporary threshold shifts in their hearing. The low-frequency sound from the boomers and sparkers is perfectly capable of causing this TTS, as previously documented. You should probably catch up on some of my prior videos. We're covering stuff that wouldn't have been included in your zoology degree or in your otter feeding internship.
This campaign to blame green energy for the recent spike in whale deaths has been dismissed by marine biologists as nothing more than a cynical disinformation campaign against offshore wind power.
And your source for that is Greenpeace, an NGO that's been in the bag for promotion of offshore wind since at least 2010. Gee, what a surprise! I guess the guy who co-founded Greenpeace doesn't count at all, right? So far into this video, she's just pointing to pro-offshore wind entities and saying, they don't think it's bad for whales, see? NOAA, CBD, Greenpeace, might as well throw in the Sierra Club or Mass Audubon or the League of Conservation Voters. Have you actually heard any expert arguments here debunking anything? Like the folks in this week's hearing who eviscerated offshore wind under oath?
This campaign to blame green energy for the recent spike in whale deaths has been dismissed by marine biologists.
You're a what? A marine biologist.
Save the whale, George.
But I tell you, Jerry, at that moment, I was a marine biologist.
Dismissed by marine biologists as nothing more than a cynical disinformation campaign against offshore wind power.
Let's just marinate for a moment in the irony that this video is lambasting anyone who scrutinizes whale deaths in the wake of offshore wind surveying as part of a, quote, cynical disinformation campaign against offshore wind. Wouldn't the very definition of cynical disinformation be a so-called explainer video delivered by someone whose employer receives money by the million from the offshore wind industry? Because that's who KP is. Kristen Plancardi, employee of the Mystic Aquarium.
Block Island is a tiny island south of mainland Rhode Island in the Atlantic Ocean. Locals wanted an energy solution that would work with the ecosystem, not harm it. Deepwater Wind, now part of Ørsted, was eager to create the first offshore wind farm in the United States. Offshore wind farms are groups of wind turbines installed in the ocean that convert kinetic wind energy into electrical energy. Europe has been using them successfully for decades to power homes and combat climate change. Before committing to the idea of building an offshore wind farm, islanders needed to understand how the project might impact local fishing, tourism, and wildlife. Once these concerns were addressed, engineers designed the wind farm. The project employed over 300 local people, a boon to the regional economy. By 2016, 5 wind turbines were completed, each stretching 600 feet into the air. The finished wind farm is a success. When the wind hits a turbine's blades, a rotor spins and a generator converts the energy into electricity. The electricity travels through a buried cable to Block Island and the mainland. This electricity powers 17,000 homes, has lowered carbon emissions by 40,000 tons per year, and has reduced residents' energy costs by 40%. Some tourists visit just to see the wind farm, making the islanders proud. Ørsted monitors the area around the wind farm for environmental impacts, which appear to be minimal. The project demonstrates that different stakeholders can work together to create renewable energy solutions, and that offshore wind energy can be a safe and effective way to combat climate change. Many more U.S. offshore wind farms will be generating electricity in the future, but it all started with these 5 turbines spinning off the coast of Block Island.
The Mystic Aquarium is making money hand over fist from offshore wind development via donations from Ørsted and Eversource. I wonder if that has anything to do with her account for funny animal videos dutifully posting this defense for the offshore wind industry. In fact, both her YouTube account and her video editor's YouTube account were created in October 2020. Not just the same year, but the very same month that the Mystic Aquarium debuted its first offshore wind promotions. How's that for cynical?
Because there is no actual evidence that wind farms affect marine mammals.
Oh, that's a new one. She's saying there's no evidence.
Let's take a look at the numbers. The United States has just 2 operational offshore wind farms with only 7 turbines combined.
Yes, only 7 completed turbines operating right now. Did we ever claim that those 7 turbines have been killing any of these whales, Kristen? No. We're talking about the thousands of planned turbines, which are currently in the pre-construction phase, where seismic activity from the offshore wind company's survey ships has been ramping up in perfect correlation with the whale deaths.
In contrast, the UK has 2,652 offshore wind turbines. But the yearly number of stranded whales? are roughly the same.
We're all dumber after hearing that. If you want to get the scoop on just how catastrophic wind farms have been on marine mammal populations across the pond, might I suggest looking at the fantastic reporting that Jason Endfield has been doing for years from Europe at jasonendfield.com. A few minutes spent perusing his documentation of the devastating effects of wind farms around the world will show you that Kristen is way out of her depth.
See where I'm going with this? The math is not mathing here.
Oh, zing! That's some humor right there. Mathing. That is drawing fits of laughter from her audience in between their mouthfuls of Tide Pods they're ingesting. It's unclear what stats she's commenting on here, but I'd like to submit some math for KP that's not mathing, as she so elegantly put it. This comes from someone who knows math, Dr. Bob Stern.
My name's Bob Stern. I have a background in math and engineering. Since December, just on the Jersey coast, we've encountered 9 whale strandings in a 3-month period. The annual average is 7. So we've seen 9 in 3 months, which is obviously an unusual spike in the number of whale strandings. What we think is happening here is what the law calls disturbance of the whale's behavior. And that can cause other things to happen. For example, a mother and calf could be swimming along. They communicate by sound, not by sight. And so if they encounter noise levels that override their communications, then the calf gets separated, and need I say more. And this also, this disturbance level noise can also cause whales to surface. With the noise level at the surface is less, so they will try to avoid the noise. But while doing that, they've lost their navigational senses, and they become more vulnerable to vessel strike. So while the word disturbance, which is in the law, may sound a little innocuous, it is not. It is not. And that's what we believe we're encountering here with these vessel surveys and other activities, and we can go into that more. It does not take a rocket scientist to come to the conclusion that that is a potential cause of what's going on. And I think any responsible person, agency, would jump at the opportunity to investigate this and see what it is. And if the agencies are so confident that this is not the cause, then fine, let's put it on the table. Let's look at other causes they present, and let's figure it out. But to just brush it off seems to us to be just irresponsible.
And necropsies were performed on the whales that washed up on the UK shores, and so far, there has not been a shred of evidence that the wind farms are to blame.
Please, let's talk about necropsies. Of course, the data that would show any effects from seismic activity on a whale is not even publicly available to us in our own country. I have no idea how we'd obtain that info from a foreign country, KP, but we'll stick with the geographic location that we are citizens of.
But if it's not wind farms, then what is behind the unusual mortality event? Well, the whales who washed up on the East Coast have been necropsied as well. According to the NOAA, there have been 178 unusual mortalities since 2016.
You people don't learn. How many times are you going to recycle this as if it proves your point? 178 sounds like a big number. Spread over all those years, what is that, like 25 a year? The number you and Noah like to try and focus on here is humpback specifically, but with a whole variety of whales, including some endangered ones, we have already blown way past 20 whale deaths in just the last few months of seismic surveying, Kristen. This is a radical spike, and to overlook it makes you just as culpable in what's happening to whales as Noah is. Excuse me, the NOAA. That sounds much more sciencey.
Almost half of the necropsied whales were hit by vessels and showed evidence of blunt force trauma.
Almost half. Covered that before. When you get through Noah's fancy footwork and weirdly non-specific numbers, it's actually more like 20% of the total dead whales that were hit by ships. Level B and C data to actually get to the heart of what we're talking about here has not been provided to ascertain whether any of those whales had experienced a temporary threshold shift. And that leaves the overwhelming majority of these whales with no data available to anyone at all. Debunking failed.
And the second leading cause of death was entanglement in fishing lines such as lobster and crab traps.
Yeah, funny how the situation we're talking about here over the last few months literally involves no deaths by entanglement, but you see where Kristen's really coming from here.
This isn't new. Ship strikes and entanglements have long been the leading cause of death in marine mammals. Even this unusual mortality event isn't new.
The explosion in whale deaths over the last few months is absolutely new. Here's a graph where a researcher plugged in whale deaths and seismic activity from the vessels working for the offshore wind developers. What's not new is people with expertise on this issue sounding the alarm that marine mammals will die from this activity.
Just looking at this logically, the only difference offshore recently has been now the presence of 5 to 6 vessel surveys out there that use high-intensity noise equipment to characterize the seabed. And they are out there simultaneously going over pretty much the same area, exposing the whales to noise levels. And this is not a new issue for us. We raised the concern about the vessel surveys over a year ago when the marine fisheries people were considering approval of these surveys. And we commented then, and we stick to our comments now, that they were significantly underestimating the vessel's impact. And it gets to various technical assumptions they were making, which we believe were just wrong. And we commented 3 or 4 times. We met with marine fisheries staff, and the comments were basically ignored. So this is not a new issue that we just raised recently. To some are accusing us of just trying to use the issue to create alarm. That's not the case. This is a long-standing concern that we have had with the way the process is proceeding.
Some scientists actually see this as evidence of something positive. Let me explain.
The whale deaths are actually good. Brace yourself for this old chestnut.
Humpback whales were first officially protected when the Endangered Species Act passed into law in 1973. At the time, there were only 10 to 15,000 humpback whales left in our oceans. They have since rebounded, and current estimated populations are around 85,000 individuals. So this seeming increase in deaths could just suggest there are more animals out there.
It's amazing. Another person repeating the same baloney talking point that the offshore wind industry cooked up about how whales are all of a sudden dying in the past few months because they're doing so darn well. I covered this in depth in the video assessment of Time Magazine's hit piece on us, so if you want to hear more about that insanity, you can go back and watch that video.
Even better, whale deaths are actually on the decline and have mostly returned to levels seen before 2016.
That's amazing. I thought we were like well over 20 whales that died, but her little graph there says only 8 have died in 2023. Oh, and then you look at the fine print there. 2023 only as of January 31st. So that's very convenient to cut out all of the deaths since January. But it's funny because this includes the, quote, critically endangered North Atlantic right whale, and she doesn't give a crap about the 2 of those whales that died since these offshore wind surveys took place. After all, look at how she covered the right whale subject only a few months ago when she was throwing a bone to her pals at the Monterey Bay Aquarium.
The number of right whales killed or injured by human activities must be limited to less than 1 per year in order for the population to recover. And the leading cause of death in northern right whales? is entanglement in vertical lines used to catch animals like lobsters. Supporters of the Maine lobster industry will point out that there hasn't been a confirmed entanglement from the lobster fishing gear in Maine since 2004. And the Maine Stewardship Council has acknowledged that there is no direct evidence to show that the fishery is responsible for entanglements of right whales. But that's not necessarily the whole story, as usual.
No, the whole story is that Kristen, like all other paid offshore wind shills, takes a 180-degree opposite stance on the reality of
no evidence
when it comes to our lobster fishery. For someone like Kristen,
no evidence
is no reason not to ban the whale-safe rope of our lobstermen.
Because when a right whale becomes entangled in lobster or crabbing gear, it is nearly impossible to detect where that gear came from. According to Monterey Bay, more than 90% of entanglements cannot be linked to a specific gear type, and only 12% of the entanglements can be linked to a specific location.
I could go on, but you see how blatant the double standard is here. Kristen's a big fan of the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and she's even raised over $10,000 from her fans for them. In a beautiful twist of poetic justice, the very $10,000 she raised for them may in fact end up being awarded in punitive damages to some of the very lobstermen that the aquarium has so maligned. Because they're getting sued for it, and we can only hope that the aquarium loses big time.
The Monterey Bay Aquarium putting Atlantic lobster on the seafood red list, which I talk about in this video right up here. I did that right.
You did that right.
Perfect.
You know, we could all just cringe at that bit of business and move on, but it's a good segue for me to point out this is an official social media influencer studio production. Besides Kristen reading the script from what is probably a teleprompter app on a cell phone, there are other professionals involved in this production, from formulating and drafting the content, to the shoot and the edit. This isn't just a homemade vlog. She's the face of it, the figurehead, but who is behind the scenes orchestrating this thing? That's something to consider. You know who's behind me, Andrew, the person making videos on this channel. It's a whole bunch of fishermen and people who support fishing, who have contributed to support the projects I do. But you've really got to consider that this particular video by KP Ashenit is probably just an undisclosed PR effort of the offshore wind industry.
And those lawmakers who want a moratorium on wind farms, what was their position on Monterey Bay Aquarium red listing Atlantic lobster to protect the critically endangered right whales? Oh right, they thought it was nonsense and introduced legislation to strip Monterey Bay of federal funding.
Oh, the horror.
And the advocacy group opposed to offshore wind farms, Clean Ocean Action, has ties to offshore oil and gas.
We blocked many fossil fuel projects. Climate change is real, and Clean Ocean Action concurs with UN Environment Program that calls for a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, 30% by 2030. Reducing fossil fuel is critical toward this goal. It is also important to note the ocean is our best buffer to climate change by absorbing nearly 90% of all the heat we've been pumping in and over 50% of the CO2. Now, while some offshore wind may hold promise, federal and state agencies have moved forward without public transparency, robust and sound science. This is too much too fast, and in a word, simply reckless.
I think the fact that the offshore wind industry recently gave $1.25 million to this wannabe influencer's employer is a far more relevant connection. And I can't resist. Do you know who has ties to the oil and gas industry, Kristen? You want to guess? The offshore wind developers. Ørsted only recently changed their name from Danish Oil and Natural Gas, which they've been presenting on their logo in the form of the unintentionally hilarious acronym DONG. Same goes for the other big players. It's literally the oil and gas companies who are having the oceans leased to them. They just wear green masks now.
So while I do believe that we should always be concerned when something in our oceans shows a negative change, I think in this case, some groups of people are trying to use a rather mundane news story about whales being hit by boats into a reason to abandon green energy operations.
We are not necessarily opposed to all offshore wind energy, but we are very adamantly opposed to what we see as an ill-informed, biased, and I hate to use that word, decision-making process, and what that has resulted in, which is specific projects in locations that will obviously cause way more harm than good.
These leases are sited on top of extremely productive historic commercial fishing grounds and important vessel transit routes. Throughout my interaction with BOEM in what cannot even be called a process, BOEM has assured the fishing industry that our interests would be taken into consideration at the end. But by this stage, it is too late, and BOEM has already designed the scope of its project review to exclude any such consideration and accommodation. BOEM states that the purpose and need for their review is to meet the goals of the developer, state energy targets, and to fulfill the speculative power purchase agreements between the developer and state utilities signed prior to federal project review. In April 2016, prior to lease sale, BOEM Director Hopper announced at a New York task force meeting that "I'm not a marine biologist, but I'm a history maker," and proceeded to speak about how BOEM and New York would make history with the first New York wind farm. The reality is that nobody in the U.S. government is at the helm actually critically regulating any of this activity. There is no independent analysis occurring. There is no oversight in what appears to be a textbook definition of regulatory capture. In reality and in practice, the offshore wind developers are at the helm. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Some groups of people are trying to use a rather mundane news story about whales being hit by boats into a reason to abandon green energy operations.
The huge spike in whale deaths is nothing more than a, quote, rather mundane news story to this marine biologist. Well, she might have a point. At the Mystic Aquarium, when whales die, the only concern is that everyone plays CYA and throws each other under the bus until the next time it happens. So maybe whale deaths really are no biggie to an employee of the Mystic Aquarium. I don't know.
Well, Mystic Aquarium is being flagged for several violations following the death of one of its beluga whales back in August of 2021. According to the USDA report, the attending veterinarian was not called when the whale, named Havoc, was showing symptoms of distress. The report also found he suffered an avoidable injury while workers tried to retrieve something a visitor dropped into the pool. We reached out to Mystic tonight. They say they tried to, quote, give the highest quality of world-class care possible.
But if it's so mundane, a big nothing, why invest the time and resources of her own performance of this script? Why were any resources poured into this coverage of what she calls a mundane news story? Who prepared this boilerplate list of offshore wind talking points for her to present, while failing to disclose that her own employer has in fact been plied with a 7-figure sum of offshore wind money? Kristen might be better off staying in her lane and sticking with otter tricks. This attempt at a debunk was a 100% fail.
On the whales that washed up, I shouldn't be like laughing.